Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening with Lukoil, which is the second largest oil producer in Russia. In fact, it's the largest private company, it's not state owned. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that Lukoil and Rosneft, which is the large state owned entity, have both been directly sanctioned by the USA and the UK recently. And this is now causing major operational problems for the business. We're starting to see reports of what's happening on the ground, and this potentially could be catastrophic for Lukoil. So if we just have a quick recap as to what Lukoil is, it's an oil producer, but it also has upstream and downstream operations. And as I explained in a previous video, upstream is basically where you own all of the oil that's coming out of the ground, all of the facilities. And then downstream is basically all of the operational side of things. So things like refineries and petrol stations, gas stations, those sorts of things. And this company is producing around 2.2 million barrels of oil equivalent. And the reason why I'm saying equivalent is because they're producing both oil and gas. So when we're talking about gas, just to keep it simple in terms of understanding how much we are talking about, we talk about gas equivalents in oil terms. So rather than me saying 100 billion cubic meters of gas, which doesn't really mean anything to everybody, if you say a million barrels of oil equivalent, it's much easier to understand. So it's producing 2.2 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. So this is a really big company. In 2024, its turnover was 8.6 trillion rubles. And if you don't speak rubles, that equates to more than $100 billion. $100 billion for one private company. This is a monster. It's absolutely massive. And its net profit in 2024 was 848 billion rubles, which is around about $10 billion. So this is a really significant company for Russia, providing a lot of employment and paying a lot of tax. So it's contributing to the GDP of the Russian economy. But because of the sanctions, it's now being choked. So we're now hearing stories of what's happening on the ground as a result of the new sanctions. And the USA sanctions gives the company until the 21st of November to finish all of its affairs. So all of its counterpart traders and buyers are now trying to get everything sorted out before the 21st of December, because if you're still seen to be dealing with Lukoil after that date, then you yourself might be subject to secondary sanctions. And that's obviously an absolute nightmare if you get sanctioned just because you bought some oil from Lukoil. So in terms of what's happening in Iraq, and you might have thought that Iraq wouldn't really care about the USA placing sanctions on Lukoil, but it does. The state marketing business, which is actually dealing with Lukoil, it's placing all of the orders, has actually cancelled 3 booked orders that were due to be delivered on the 11th, 18th and 26th of November. I think that's interesting because 2 of those deliveries were actually due to be made before the 21st of November. So Iraq is taking quite a cautious approach here. It's basically walking away from all of the Lukoil business even before that new deadline comes in. And when you get cancellations like this, what it means is that the Iraqi state business is now buying that oil from somewhere else. So this won't be a short-term blip for Lukoil. This is basically Iraq cancelling that arrangement. And Lukoil has a trading arm which is based in Switzerland, and that's now being blocked. So brokers and shippers are refusing business because of the new sanctions. And this means crude can't move, it won't get delivered, and therefore there's no finance, no payments going into Lukoil for this. And counterparts in banking, in finance, have begun freezing payments to the downstream affiliate of Lukoil because of sanction concerns. And this means that the retail fuel supply chains and payment flows are under threat because Lukoil operates lots of different gas stations all around Europe. And as a direct result, Lukoil's fuel chain in Finland is now experiencing stress due to those frozen payments. So a lot of the stations are not open, and this puts all of those jobs at risk. So that's obviously Lukoil employees, but they're based in Finland. So you can start to understand how this might have an impact overseas, not just in Russia, because Lukoil does have some significant overseas assets, as I talked about in a recent video. In Bulgaria and Romania, where Lukoil owns two major refineries and it's actually an important player in terms of the supply in both of those countries. And also, it has significant fuel retail networks, so it's got gas stations all across both countries. There's growing concern about the continuity of supply, export curbs, and the knock on effect on the regional fuel markets. So, the governments of both Bulgaria and Romania are now looking into the situation and potentially thinking about nationalising those assets. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, Lukoil is currently looking to dispose of all of its overseas assets as a result of the fact that none of them can actually continue trading due to the new sanctions. And it was announced that a deal has been struck with a company called Gunvor, which is officially based in Switzerland. It's also registered in Cyprus, and it's majority owned by a Swedish national. However, it was established with a Russian business owner back in the past. He's now exited the business. So I think it does have strong links with Russia and Lukoil. And it's agreed to buy all of the overseas assets for $22 billion. However, it's not going to be as simple as that, because this is going to require approval, and that business will need to make sure that it doesn't get caught up in all of the sanctions that are now applied against Lukoil. So I don't think it's going to be quite as straightforward as just handing over $22 billion and carrying on trading as it is. And in fact, if you're sitting in Gunvor's seat, then if you have to reduce the price as a result of the impact of the sanctions, then that's probably not a bad thing, is it? Because everybody wants to pay as low a price as possible when they're buying anything. So although that deal has been announced and a price has been put forward, I don't know whether or not it will go through. Now, in terms of assessing that price of $22 billion, in the previous video, I went through some of those assets, and it was difficult to put a full price on all of them. But the historic price that was paid by Lukoil was hundreds of billions of dollars. So in a ballpark, I'd be guessing it was around about 400 or 500 billion that Lukoil has invested into all of these assets. So when you're selling that for 22 billion, that's not really a great deal. Lukoil is losing an absolute fortune here. But it will be surprising if that 22 billion is actually just paid over to Lukoil, because I think there'll be a question. If Lukoil has been sanctioned, how will Governor actually make the payment? Because you can't make payments to sanctioned entities. So whether or not the 22 billion ever actually gets to Lukoil, gets to Russia, I doubt it. It might get frozen, because that's what's happened with a lot of the overseas assets that Russia had at the start of the invasion of Ukraine. That money is still sitting in bank accounts all around the world. Russia doesn't have access to it. I think that's what might happen with this. The last thing that the sanctions will allow is Lukoil getting a $22 billion windfall. Just can't see that happening. Now, in terms of the impact on Lukoil at the moment, I thought it was worth going through some of those. Well, in terms of cash flow, it's been devastating. These sanctions have basically stopped all of the cash flow. And that cash flow is really important to Lukoil, because a lot of it was in overseas currencies. And overseas currencies are really valuable in Russia right now because nobody wants to deal in rubles. It's had to write down the value of all of these overseas assets. But it's not just that, it's also impacting on its overall business, because it's a global oil business. It's doing lots of trading. So if it has surplus supplies in Russia, it can just export them, and vice versa. If it needs more in Russia, it can bring things in. But it can't do any of that at the moment because of the sanctions. So it's lost all of its contacts, all of its relationships, all of its payments. And this is basically converting Lukoil from a global entity into a Russian-only entity. So it's become very isolated. And that's not really where you want to be in the global world of oil, because the oil business is genuinely global. And this company was a major player, but unfortunately, it's being killed by the new sanctions. Now, that's obviously bad news for Lukoil, but it's also bad news for the Russian economy, because this is one of the largest companies in Russia. It's handling a huge volume of oil, therefore it's pulling in a lot of revenue. Much of that revenue was in overseas currency, which is useful to the Russian state. So this company was paying a large amount of tax, contributing to the Russian GDP. all of that is now going south. So Lukoil is shrinking as a business, its revenue is crashing, it won't be paying as much tax. In fact, it might not pay any tax if it goes into a loss situation because it can't actually process all of its sales and get all of its revenue in, because Lukoil is a very high fixed cost business. It still has to pay for all of its facilities and its people and all of that sort of thing. So none of that has changed overnight, but what has changed is its revenue. That has gone through the floor, and so Lukoil will be struggling to turn a profit, and so therefore it won't be contributing in terms of paying tax to the Russian state, and that's obviously further bad news for Russian GDP at a time when Russia is already struggling. But I think the bigger issue here for Russia is that the West is now targeting individual Russian companies. Up until now, it was happy to let Rosneft and Lukoil carry on because it was considered necessary to keep the global supply of oil stable. However, as demand is falling for oil and output is rising, that's no longer necessary. So this is bad news for Russia because the walls are definitely closing in terms of the tightening of the sanctions. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we talked about the sanctions being announced on Lukoil and Rosneft, but I wanted to give you some tangible feedback as to what's happening on the ground. And what we are seeing is that Lukoil's international business has been decimated. It's fallen apart within a few days of these sanctions being announced because nobody wants to get caught up in secondary sanctions. India and China have been very worried about secondary sanctions over the past few months. We've seen the amount of oil that they're purchasing from Russia going down significantly. Turkey is now joining that party. I posted a video recently talking about the fact that Turkey has pulled back on its Russian oil purchases, which I think is a major surprise because up until this point, Turkey has been quite happily dealing with Russia on an ongoing basis, despite the fact that it's a member of NATO. So it's got a bit of a conflict of interest there. But we're seeing lots of different countries pulling back from dealing with Russia. But as a direct result of these new sanctions on Lukoil, we are seeing all of the counterparties deciding that they don't want to carry on buying, including countries like Iraq, which I think is relatively surprising. So Lukoil is seeing its overseas business disappearing. It's trying to do a fire sale, talked about that in the previous video, and it's agreed a deal notionally to sell those assets for $22 billion, which is a fraction of what Lukoil has invested into those products. But also, it's losing a huge chunk of revenue. Those assets will be producing more than $22 billion worth of revenue. I can guarantee it. If this business is turning over hundreds of billions of dollars, which it is, then those assets, which are an important part of its overseas structure, will have been pulling in a lot of money. So this is basically a complete disaster. However, as I said earlier, I don't think Lukoil will see a cent of that deal because the sanctions won't allow anybody to make payments to Lukoil. So you can sell it for whatever you like. You're not going to actually receive the cash. And cash flow is a real problem for Lukoil at the moment because it's got a very high fixed cost base. So it needs money to keep coming in. But that money has literally died away within the space of a few days. So Lukoil is in serious trouble here, and it's going to have to rebuild itself, but it can only really focus on the Russian market. Over the last 30 years, this company has really started to expand its overseas presence. It made a number of different purchases. It's got gas stations in various European countries. It's got upstream and downstream facilities. So it was looking like a major global player. Unfortunately, that's no longer the situation. It's now just a Russian player. And as we've talked about before, the Russian market is in difficulty at the moment. The Russian economy is having severe problems. It's likely that we could see the Russian economy going into recession within the next 6 months. So all of this is seriously bad news for Lukoil. But it's also really bad news for the Russian economy because we're talking about one of Russia's largest companies operating some of its biggest oil facilities is now in serious difficulty. So that means that the employees of that company may be potentially put out of work. So we might see mass redundancies happening across Russia. That would have a negative impact on all of the locations that those people live in because they won't be spending in their local economy. We get the negative multiplier effect of people not spending. So stores in those areas and businesses in those areas will struggle because they won't get as much revenue. So there will be a negative impact across the board. But in terms of Russian GDP, Lukoil is a big contributor in terms of paying a lot of tax. Now that it's got significantly smaller operations, it won't pay as much tax. Therefore, it won't contribute as much to Russian GDP. And this is a further blow to the Russian economy at a time when Russia is already severely suffering. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I said, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done so already, please. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through to the end. And thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me either through YouTube membership or Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee or YouTube Super Thanks or Buy Me a Coffee membership. Thank you for that support. Really means a lot to me. And here's something to put a smile on your face.